Imagine cruising at 31,000 feet, thousands of feet above the ground, when suddenly everything goes silent in the cockpit. The pilots, experienced and trained, are slumped over, completely unconscious, leaving the massive commercial jet hurtling through the sky with no one at the controls. Panic spreads through the cabin as passengers realize something is terribly wrong. Hearts pound, phones are out, and fear fills the air. Amid the chaos, one unlikely hero emerges: a young woman on board, far from a trained pilot, who suddenly finds herself facing a situation no one could ever imagine. With the plane climbing higher, alarms blaring, and every second ticking like a lifetime, she makes a choice that could mean the difference between disaster and survival. This isn't just a story of a flight gone wrong. It's about courage, quick thinking, and the extraordinary strength of an ordinary person rising to an impossible challenge. As the aircraft wobbles in the sky and ground control scrambles for answers, everyone on board and everyone watching holds their breath. How does a young woman take control when lives hang in the balance? The answer is coming, but what happens next will shock you and keep you on the edge of your seat. The young woman's mind raced as she stared at the cockpit controls. A tangle of buttons, switches, and screens she had only ever seen in movies. She was just an ordinary passenger, heading home after a long trip. But suddenly, the fate of hundreds of people rested on her shoulders. Around her, the cabin was a mix of fear and confusion. Passengers clutched their armrests, some crying, some whispering prayers, and some trying to call loved ones. Every movement she made was watched. Every decision weighed in the collective heartbeat of the plane. She had some basic knowledge of planes from a flying lesson she had taken years ago, but this was nothing like practice. The autopilot was still on, but she knew it wouldn't last forever, and she had to figure out a way to keep the jet stable. Meanwhile, ground control was trying to make contact, their voices crackling through the radio, but panic and static made every word hard to follow. As she adjusted dials and monitored the altitude, flashes of memories and instructions came to her mind, lessons she had almost forgotten. She could feel the plane trembling slightly, and the reality of the situation hit her. One wrong move could be catastrophic. The hours ahead promised tension, uncertainty, and a test of courage she never imagined she would face. The young woman's hands shook slightly as she gripped the yoke, trying to steady the plane while listening to the frantic chatter over the radio. Ground control was issuing instructions, their calm voices barely cutting through her rising panic. Around her, the passengers were a whirlwind of emotion. A mother clutched her sleeping child tightly, whispering reassurances she didn't fully believe. An elderly man muttered prayers under his breath, eyes wide as he stared at the cockpit door. Every face reminded her that the stakes were real, every life depended on her decisions. Meanwhile, flight attendants were doing their best to keep people calm, moving through the aisles with soothing words, but the fear was contagious. Some passengers were trying to offer help, shouting questions or advice, creating another layer of chaos that she had to filter through. She realized she couldn't act alone. She needed guidance, strategy, and nerves of steel. In the cockpit, warning lights blinked, each one a reminder that time was slipping away. The autopilot was failing slowly, and she could feel the plane dipping slightly with every turn. Thoughts raced: what if the engine sputtered, or a sudden turbulence pushed the plane off course? She had to focus, balancing technical knowledge with sheer instinct, while every second brought new tension. Outside the windows, the sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in fiery orange, a beautiful contrast to the terror inside. The young woman knew she had to act, but the path forward was murky, and every choice carried unimaginable risk. The plane shuddered violently as a sudden gust of turbulence ripped through the cabin, tossing passengers against their seatbelts. Alarms screamed in the cockpit, red lights flashing relentlessly. The young woman's heart raced, but she forced herself to breathe, scanning the controls for anything she could use to stabilize the aircraft. Ground control's voice came through in urgent bursts, but she could barely process the instructions over the pounding of her own pulse. Around her, the tension in the cabin was suffocating. A young boy cried out for his father, and a woman gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Flight attendants tried to calm everyone, but their voices shook too. Every second felt like a lifetime, and the thought that the pilots might never recover weighed heavily on her. She adjusted the throttle and tried to correct the plane's tilt, but the aircraft dipped again, almost violently, sending a wave of panic through the cabin. Her mind raced. Autopilot was failing. Fuel levels were stable, but every system seemed to demand her attention. And above all, she couldn't let fear take over. Through the haze of panic, she caught sight of the instrument's warning of a sudden drop in altitude. She pressed buttons she didn't fully understand, hoping instinct and memory would guide her. Outside, the horizon twisted with clouds that seemed alive, as if the storm itself were testing her resolve. Every heartbeat, every decision, brought her closer to the edge, teetering between disaster and the impossible chance of survival. If you want, I can write the next section that finally reaches the climax, the most intense and high-stakes moment of the story. Do you want me to continue with that? Just as she thought she was gaining a small measure of control, another warning light flashed, this time indicating a possible engine malfunction. Panic gripped her chest like a vice. The hum of the engine suddenly felt uneven, and the plane shuddered again, tilting sharply. Ground control's voice became frantic, issuing commands and warnings faster than she could follow. Every choice now carried even higher stakes. In the cabin, fear turned into chaos. Passengers screamed, some praying, some trying to hold onto the seats or each other. Flight attendants moved frantically down the aisles, shouting instructions and trying to maintain order. The young woman felt the weight of every life aboard pressing down on her. She knew she couldn't afford hesitation, yet the complexity of the situation was almost paralyzing. Her mind raced, flipping through everything she remembered from that single flight lesson years ago. She toggled switches and adjusted dials, praying that instinct and memory would be enough to keep the plane steady. Outside, dark storm clouds loomed, streaked with flashes of lightning, as if the sky itself sensed the tension inside the cabin. Then, just when she thought she had a handle on one crisis, a new alert blinked on the panel: on autopilot override warning. The system, which had been her lifeline, was now malfunctioning, threatening to throw the plane into a dive. With turbulence, panicked passengers, and failing instruments, the young woman faced a new, almost impossible challenge. Every second brought a fresh danger, and the line between disaster and survival grew thinner by the moment. The young woman's fingers flew over the controls, her mind a storm of focus and fear. The engines roared unevenly, alarms shrieking in the cockpit, but somehow she kept the plane from tilting into a fatal dive. Sweat dripped down her face as she toggled switches, adjusted flaps, and tried to stabilize the aircraft. Passengers' screams echoed behind her, and every second felt like an eternity. Ground control's voices cut through the chaos, clearer now, guiding her through maneuvers that seemed impossible. Step by step, the plane leveled out. The shuddering slowed. The autopilot, though glitching, began responding again as she carefully followed instructions, the aircraft finally regaining steadiness at cruising altitude. Relief washed over her, but there was no time to relax. The storm outside still raged. Clouds streaked with lightning, reflecting the tension in the cabin. As she breathed a shaky sigh, thinking the worst was over, a final alert lit up on the panel. The landing gear was not deploying. Panic returned in a sharp wave, but with calm determination, she remembered a manual override method from a past lesson. Following it, she watched with bated breath as the gear locked into place. The plane shuddered one last time on approach, then touched down on the runway with a thunderous roar. Passengers erupted in cheers, tears flowing freely, hugging each other, and flight attendants rushed forward, amazed at what had just been accomplished. Just as the cabin began to settle, a mysterious voice came over the radio, calm and clear. "Excellent work, but are you ready for what comes next?" Her heart skipped a beat, realizing that this was only the beginning of something far bigger. The plane finally came to a complete stop, tires screeching on the runway as emergency crews rushed alongside. The young woman slumped back in her seat, exhausted but alive, her hands trembling from the intensity of what she had just endured. Around her, passengers hugged, cried, and whispered thanks, their relief palpable. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking on everyone, sharing smiles and words of comfort, turning chaos into a moment of shared triumph. News crews and emergency teams flooded the tarmac, capturing the story of an ordinary passenger who had stepped into an extraordinary situation and saved hundreds of lives. Authorities confirmed that the pilots were safely recovering, and the plane itself was secure. In interviews later, passengers spoke of courage, quick thinking,